In October 2009, on a gray morning outside Huron, Travis Tucker turned into Larkin Ag Supply in a 1996 Chevrolet K2500 with 312,000 miles, rust eaten through both rear fenders, and a grain shovel wired across the tailgate because the latch had failed 2 harvests earlier. The truck idled rough, then steadied, and he sat a second before stepping down in patched brown overalls with stitching at both knees and one shoulder strap repaired with baling twine. Men near the service bay looked once, then looked away in the practiced way rural people do when they think they already know the full story. Around town, Travis was the Tucker who never modernized, the one still running old iron, the one living in a farmhouse with a porch roof that leaked into a bucket every spring. What those same men did not see was a ledger in his kitchen drawer showing zero-term debt, 2,060 acres owned free and clear, and $418,000 in treasury notes laddered in conservative blocks. They saw worn denim. They did not see optionality. They saw rust and assumed shortage. They did not see that he had spent 18 years buying land in quiet increments, while others upgraded cabs and rolled debt forward. Wade Larkin came out of the showroom wearing a pressed dealership shirt with his stitched name above the pocket, polished belt buckle, and clean boots that had not touched a muddy field that week. His pickup in the front row was 1 model year old with dealer plates and chrome bright enough to mirror the sky. He greeted 2 larger operators first, then turned toward Travis with a half smile that was friendly only at the surface. "You still nursing that museum iron through another fall," he said, loud enough for 3 mechanics and a seed rep to hear. "One wet season, and that Tucker lease ground will have a different name on it." Socially, that line mattered more than it sounded. The Tucker grain contract had run 3 generations without a missed delivery. In their county, that record carried more weight than church attendance and more memory than a family Bible. If Travis failed this year, people would not discuss weather or market basis first. They would say the name had slipped. His answer was short. "I run what I own." By the second week of October, that sentence had become a local joke in coffee shops where financed tractors were discussed like sports teams. Yet it had not been a slogan for Travis. It had been a rule built from memory he had never tried to dramatize. He was 10 years old during the hardest stretch of the farm crisis, old enough to understand numbers, but too young to control any of them. In March 1986, he stood by a stock trailer while his father sold 87 bred cows to keep current on an operating note whose interest rate had climbed above 14% after a reset they had not expected to survive. He remembered the auctioneer's cadence, his mother counting checks at the kitchen table, and his father saying one sentence to no one in particular: "Debt collects whether rain comes or not." They kept their home quarter, lost leased acres, and worked back from less, but Travis carried that arithmetic into adulthood with a kind of quiet severity. He never confused expanding with strengthening. When he took over day-to-day decisions in 1991, he started with 320 acres owned and 1,100 leased, 1 older combine, 2 tractors, and no appetite for impressing anybody. His first independent year penciled thin. Spring wheat averaged 38 bushels per acre on 640 acres at $3.21. Sunflower grossed enough to keep fuel paid, and after inputs and repairs, he cleared $41,300. He did not celebrate. He bought treasury notes and waited. In 1992, he cleared $48,700 and banked $31,000. In 1993, after hail-clipped yields, he still saved $24,600 by delaying every non-essential purchase and repairing a transmission himself instead of trading up. Then came the accumulation outsiders never tracked in real time. Over 18 years, he turned retained earnings into land whenever retirement timing, estate pressure, or cash needs sales opened a narrow window. Most parcels were unfashionable pieces, larger bidders skipped while chasing bigger blocks. And some years he bought nothing at all, choosing to stack reserves until terms favored the cash. When volatility hit and credit tightened, he could move without a bank committee and close quickly. By harvest 2009, those quiet purchases had added 1,740 acres to his original 320, bringing the total to 2,060 owned outright with no liens attached. The detailed sequence sat in his drawer, line by line, but town memory reduced it to one false impression. Old truck, old combine, no money. Each purchase altered risk in a way a new machine never could. Owned ground reduced annual lease exposure. No bank lien on land meant no lender forcing liquidation after one bad cycle. No term note meant no mandatory payment date disconnected from weather. Evidence suggests this is the central trade-off modern operators wrestle with: speed and comfort now versus resilience later. Travis chose resilience every time, even when it made him look backward. The equipment story looked crude from the road, but coherent on paper. He ran a 1989 John Deere 9,600 combine with 5,900 separator hours because he knew every belt path and bearing sound. He kept a parts shelf in his shop labeled with grease pencil, feeder chain links, idler pulleys, 2 hydro hoses, seals, sensors bought at auction lots for 1/3 retail. He tracked downtime by hour, not mood. In 2006, he spent $9,480 on preventive repairs and avoided a mid-season failure that would have cost far more in delayed harvest. In 2007, he pre-bought diesel at lower summer prices, saving 47 cents per gallon across 9,200 gallons, a $4,324 advantage created by timing instead of luck. By that fall, even people who laughed at the paint and dents had started calling when their own machinery slipped a bearing or an auger chain during crunch days. Travis's combine had become, quietly, part of more contingency plans than anyone admitted in public because reliability in harvest week was measured in hours running, not model year. His living costs were plain enough to be mistaken for hardship. Housing repairs ran $2,900 that year, mostly shingles and porch patching. Food for the household was $7,400. Utilities were $4,100. Clothing was $620, including insulated boots, bought on end-of-season clearance. Church and local giving was $3,000, paid in small checks in one anonymous envelope after a barn fire down the road. He had money and still lived like a man waiting for weather to teach humility again. That posture was not performative thrift. It was structural discipline, and it compounded. In early September 2009, at a consignment yard near Woolsey, he bought a pallet of mixed bearings, 2 alternators, and 3 belts for $780 because he recognized part numbers other bidders ignored. A week later, he and his nephew spent a Saturday rebuilding a grain cart auger, coupling with $64 in steel and 3 hours of labor instead of ordering a dealer assembly quoted at $1,180. The nephew asked once why they always fixed before replacing. Travis answered without looking up from a wrench. Because. Paid for works. The boy laughed, then repeated it all fall. Wade Larkin kept making his rounds at elevators and coffee counters, pressing urgency in polished language. He spoke of efficiency, tax strategy, low promotional rates, and the danger of falling behind. Some of his points were not wrong. New equipment can reduce labor and narrow timing risk. The underlying tension was financing structure. Promotional rates expired. Variable notes reset. Yield risk did not care about brochures. Travis listened when Wade talked and never argued in public. He would nod, say, "Not today," and climb back into the old Chevrolet with the wired tailgate and the fuel receipt folded in his shirt pocket. 3 days before full harvest, with forecasts hinting rain inside 10 days, he walked his machine shed after supper, touched the 9,600 feeder house with a mechanic's habit, and checked his spare inventory against the coming acres one more time. He had 1,480 acres to clear, a family contract to meet, and no intention of signing a note in panic. The decision path was already set. Within days, it would face its hardest test. The test arrived before daylight, when Travis turned the key on the 1989 John Deere 9600 to warm it for final pre-harvest checks. The hydrostatic drive answered with a hard metallic whine, then a drop in pressure that sent the gauge flat in less than 4 seconds. He shut it down, opened panels, and found seepage where there should have been none. 15 minutes later, rotating the feeder by hand, he felt chain slack and saw a crack traveling from one side plate toward the center seam. One machine, 2 critical failures, 3 days before full run. By 6:40 that morning, he was back at Larkin Ag Supply in the same rusted Chevrolet, overalls still patched, grease on his left cuff, asking for parts prices he already knew would sting. Wade Larkin met him at the counter with a tablet in hand and practiced concern arranged across his face. The hydrostatic pump list was $11,860. Rebuilt exchange, if available, was $7,940 plus core. Feeder house chain assembly was $2,480. Labor, if dealer installed, another $3,200 to $4,100 depending on hidden wear. Even in a best case, Travis was looking at about $14,000, and 2 to 5 days he no longer had. Wade slid to his real pitch in less than a minute. A late model combine on lot, $486,000, 10% down, 9.75% interest, 7 annual payments of $74,112. Responsible operators lock in uptime, he said, voice carrying toward the waiting chairs. You cannot clear 1,480 acres on salvage planning. Travis studied the printout without touching it. The annual payment alone was larger than what his father once lost in 2 bad seasons combined, and the total of scheduled annual payments over 7 years came to $518,784. With a 10% down payment, total cash outlay would be $567,384, not counting insurance and depreciation. He asked one question. How much if I pay cash today for that machine? Wade gave a small laugh and said nobody paid cash at that scale anymore. That was answer enough. Travis folded the quote, put it in his shirt pocket beside a fuel receipt, and walked out past new paint, polished tires, and fluorescent lights that made every panel gleam like certainty. On the gravel lot, with wind pushing cold from the northwest, he called 2 places and then a third. At 9:15, he reached a consignment yard listing that had drawn almost no attention. A 1978 International Harvester, 1480, rough tin, faded red, 6,400 engine hours showing, header included, sold as is. The manager said the prior owner had parked it after a clean grain elevator issue and never returned. Asking price was $19,500. Travis drove there immediately, climbed the ladder, checked walkers, sieves, cylinder bars, chains, and wiring, then crawled beneath with a flashlight and a pocket magnet. At 11:50, he offered $18,000. They settled at $18,400 cash with a handwritten bill of sale and a same-day loadout. This is where outsiders usually assume stubbornness, but the arithmetic was clean. He projected 1,480 acres to cut. If the 1,480 could average only 115 acres per day in weather windows, he still had a path, narrow but real, with no annual note attached. He spent $3,260 on belts, bearings, one used clean grain elevator section, and fluids. He and his nephew logged 31 hours over 2 nights in the shed, replacing worn components, aligning chains, setting clearances, and reworking a light harness from spare wire and heat shrink. Total machine cost after repairs was $21,660. If it failed completely after this season, salvage value in local parts demand would likely return $7,000 to $9,500. The risk was bounded. The financed alternative was not. The deeper roots of that decision ran older than either combined. Travis had learned no debt discipline from more than one source, and the first was pain. During the crisis years, he watched families with strong yields lose farms anyway because timing and interest resets did not care about effort. But a second source was quieter and equally decisive. An older neighbor named Walter Klein, who had farmed through drought cycles with stubborn patience, and a pencil ledger that never left his coat pocket. In 1991, when Travis was short cash after a transmission repair and embarrassed to ask for terms on a used drill, Walter sold him the drill for $1,200 and said 5 words that stayed for life. "Pay me when you can." Travis paid him in 8 months with no interest and brought an extra $60 anyway. Walter refused the $60 and told him to buy grease and keep his bearings full. By the 3rd week of October 2009, with harvest pressure building by the hour, that old lesson remained the governing framework. Debt was not immoral to Travis. It was non-trivial risk, priced too low during good weather and too high during bad weather. He had tested that premise across nearly 2 decades of operating data. In years when gross receipts were strong, he stored liquidity. In years when yields dropped, he reduced exposure rather than defend image. He carried treasury notes because they could be liquidated without asking permission. He bought land when forced sellers needed certainty, not applause, and he let his lifestyle stay modest enough that a weak season did not trigger desperation. His year-by-year ledger made that pattern undeniable when read straight through. 1991, net farm income, $41,300, treasury purchase $18,000. 1992, net $48,700, retained $31,000. 1993 hail year, net $33,900, retained $24,600. 1994, bought 80 acres for $52,000 cash from an estate sale where delayed closing would have killed the deal. 1995, no land purchase, machinery repairs $6,240, treasury ladder increased by $22,000. 1996, prepaid fertilizer and diesel saved $9,180 against in-season pricing. 1997, leased less, kept margins, retained $37,400. 1998, replaced roof sections for $2,300, instead of financing a remodel. 1999, bought 120 acres for $96,000 cash from a retiring cousin who wanted clean transfer. 2000 through 2002, average annual retention, $44,000 despite two thin yield years. 2003, bought 160 acres for $184,000 cash. 2004 through 2007, no major machinery notes, annual reserve growth between $28,000 and $63,000. 2008, panic sale, bought 220 acres for $341,000 cash with immediate possession. The ugliest weather week would test exactly how that arithmetic held, and whether the man everyone called outdated would become the person others called first in a crisis. What made his approach look primitive in public was often just delayed gratification rendered visible. He patched overalls instead of buying new ones because fabric did not lift yields. He kept the 1996 Chevrolet alive with salvage yard panels and careful maintenance because a truck payment would not cut a single acre. He itemized household spending with the same seriousness he used on fertilizer rates. Housing repairs, $2,900, food, $7,400, utilities, $4,100, clothing, $620, giving $3,000. Total personal and household outflow, see $18,020, on an operation that moved hundreds of thousands through crop revenue. The gap became reserves. Reserves became choices. Early discipline also meant refusing false urgency in machinery markets. In 2005, a dealer offered him a near-new planter package for $74,000 at an introductory rate that would have reset after 36 months. He rebuilt his existing planter with meters, openers, and chains for $6,380 and gained 3 more seasons. In 2007, he was quoted $32,000 for a replacement grain drill and bought one at retirement auction for $3,900, then spent $420 on calibration parts. In 2008, he compared a finance grain cart at $41,600 against repairing his own for $1,140 in steel and bearings. He chose repair. That pattern did not produce showroom photos. It produced retained capital measured in 6 figures. None of this insulated him from immediate danger in October 2009. Rain forecasts were tightening, and basis had widened by 22 cents per bushel. Delivery timing on the family contract carried real penalties, and the maximum exposure approached $96,000 if he failed to meet schedule. Yet his no-note structure changed the physics of stress. He did not have a bank calling for updated collateral values. He did not have a lender requiring a refinance meeting during harvest. He had a rough machine, a narrow weather window, paid-for fuel from summer pre-buys, and control over his next move. The 148 reached his yard just after sunset on a lowboy with 1 marker light flickering and 2 tires that looked more tired than dangerous. Aaron stood by the shop door with a clipboard and wrote each repair line as Travis called it out: primary belt, feeder chain tension, elevator patch, bearings on clean grain auger, engine oil and filter, hydraulic top-off, header height sensor check. His nephew handled wrenches and lights without chatter. Near midnight, Travis paused, looked at the old red machine streaked with dust and faded paint, and said the only thing resembling optimism he allowed himself that week: "If she runs steady, we finish." At 2:10 in the morning, with the shed doors shut against the wind, they turned the key. The engine coughed twice, caught and settled into a working idle that sounded uneven for 12 seconds before smoothing into rhythm. Travis watched gauges, checked for leaks, engaged the separator briefly, disengaged, then stepped down and listened from the ground with his head slightly tilted. Like a man reading a language others stopped studying years ago. No speeches, no bravado, just assessment. At 3:05, he wrote one number on Aaron's clipboard: 21,660. Total cost to acquire and field ready the so-called junk combine that now carried a family name and a season on its belts. Aaron circled the number once, then set the clipboard on a nail by the door and handed Travis a thermos that still steamed in the cold shed. He drank, listened to the idle, and nodded toward the service light over the feeder housing. "Grease it again at dawn," he said. Then we cut. Outside, the 1996 Chevrolet sat with frost building along the hood seams and rust dark under the yard light, looking exactly like what people in town believed about him. Inside the shop, the arithmetic told a different story. The machine in front of them had to run, but it did not have to run forever. It had to carry one season without adding one note. By sunrise on October 18th, the 1480 was in a wheat field east of the home quarter, and Travis was tracking acres, fuel burn, and unload times in a pocket notebook with squared pages. He logged 41.6 acres by noon, then 39.8 before dark after a belt adjustment that cost 27 minutes. He did not chase peak speed. He chased completion risk. The distinction looked small from the road and enormous in a ledger. At 2.9 gallons per acre, using diesel bought during summer, pre-buy windows at an average of $2.41 per gallon, his fuel costs sat near $6.99 per acre. Nearby operators who bought in season at $2.88 were closer to $8.35. Over 1,480 acres that spread alone represented $2,012 saved, created by timing months earlier. The same pattern sat behind every major line in his books. He had not become secure through one dramatic year. He had stacked ordinary years without interruption. His sequence, written in pencil and updated each winter, read like dry inventory until somebody did the full math. 1991, retained earnings after tax and living costs, $18,000. 1992, $31,000. 1993, $24,600 despite hail loss. 1994, 80 acres purchased for $52,000 cash. Reserve balance reduced to $11,200 and rebuilt within 14 months. 1996, 60 acres from a widow sale for $43,800 cash. 1998, 100 acres for $76,000 cash. 1999, 120 acres for $96,000 cash. 2001, 180 acres for $172,800 cash. 2002, 160 acres for $166,400 cash. 2003, 160 acres for $184,000 cash. 2004, 140 acres for $173,600 cash. 2005, 210 acres for $285,600 cash. 2006, 170 acres for $258,400 cash. 2007, 140 acres for $236,600 cash. 2008, 220 acres for $341,000 cash when panic selling hit. 12 purchases, $2,086,200 total, paid. No liens filed, no renewals negotiated, no maturity wall waiting in a bad year. Aaron tapped that penciled sequence once at the kitchen table, then flipped to a fresh page for the week's running totals. Whether the old combine could beat the storm would be settled infield, one logged hour at a time, before rain reached Huron. By the evening of the second harvest day, Travis had crossed 270 acres, and Aaron had already transferred field notes to the kitchen ledger. She ran totals the way he taught her: gross potential, variable costs, fixed obligations, then stress tests at lower commodity prices. At $7.42, spring wheat, projected gross looked solid. At $6.40, still workable. At $5.90, uncomfortable, but survivable without forced sales, because term debt payments were zero. That single zero changed every downstream outcome. A finance combine at Wade's terms would have imposed $74,112 per year, regardless of yield, basis, moisture discount, or global market mood. Add insurance, likely $11,000 to $14,000 annually, and the mandatory cash drain moved near $86,000 before one filter, one tire, or 1 acre of fertilizer. Travis never treated that as ideology. He treated it as exposure. His annual household outflow was $18,020. Even in lean crop years, that amount could be covered through conservative reserves and part of one Treasury ladder maturity. A large machinery note could not. In September 2009, his Treasury notes totaled $418,000 in staggered maturities from 6 months to 4 years at rates between 1.9% and 3.4%. Those notes were not designed to impress anyone. They were designed to buy time when weather or markets stopped cooperating. Combined with owned land and low personal burn, they formed a framework where bad seasons were painful, but not terminal. At county average land values near $2,150 per acre in late 2009, his 2,060 owned acres carried an approximate market value of $4,429,000. Subtract zero-term debt and very modest short payables, and his net worth sat well above what anybody guessed when he stepped out of a truck with a wired tailgate latch. The contrast with his peers was not moral superiority. It was financing structure meeting the same external pressure. Eli Moreland was diligent, skilled, and well-regarded, and he followed advice that looked rational at the time. In 2006 and 2007, he financed 2 late-model combines and planter upgrades totaling $1,120,000, partly fixed, partly variable, with introductory rates near 4.1%. When rates reset and credit tightened, blended cost moved to 8.9%. His annual machinery debt service jumped from roughly $102,000 to $147,000. At the same time, 2 lease agreements rolled to higher bids, input prices climbed, and one wet fall cut quality discounts into already thin margins. Eli did not fail because he was reckless. He failed because several non-trivial variables moved against him at once while obligations stayed rigid. He lost 2,400 leased acres at auction and spent that winter selling equipment under pressure. June Halverson and her son Peter carried a different version of the same trap. Their machinery notes totaled $640,000. Their operating line sat near $380,000. And 2 short crops in 3 years narrowed room to breathe. Interest on the line alone nearly doubled as terms changed, rising from the upper 20,000 range into the 50,000 range annually. They sold their cow herd first to protect land. Then they sold 40 acres they never planned to part with. Nobody in their township mocked them. People watched and learned in silence because June and Peter worked hard and still got cornered by timing. Curtis Dane borrowed against land equity to chase high-rent ground when corn prices had made expansion look like prudence. He took on leases at $312 per acre across blocks that demanded perfect weather and strong fall bids to cash flow. Fertilizer costs surged. Then corn settled below break-even for his structure. He filed Chapter 12, not because he disliked risk, but because his model required too many favorable inputs at once. He told Travis one afternoon at the elevator, "I did the math. I just did it with hopeful numbers." Travis answered with his usual economy, "Hope is not a line item." There was no lecture in it, only shared fatigue. By October 21st, rain probability in updated forecasts moved above 60% inside a 5-day band, and basis widened another few cents as local elevators managed space and moisture risk. Every day of delay now translated directly into contract danger. Travis had 1,480 acres to finish, and an estimated maximum penalty near $96,000 if deliveries missed contracted windows. The pressure was not abstract. He watched cloud banks stack in the west and recalculated finish dates at breakfast, noon, and after dark. The broader economic backdrop added weight. Credit committees across the region had tightened after the financial shocks of the prior year, and several local operators had their operating lines trimmed between 10% and 20% just as input bills arrived. Suppliers asked for faster payment cycles. Variable rate notes repriced higher. Landlords wanted stronger guarantees. In a looser cycle, those frictions could be managed with refinancing. In this one, refinancing came with harder terms and shorter patience. Farmers who looked strongest in glossy equipment brochures often had the least room for a weather miss. Travis's survival mechanism remained plain. He had prepaid a meaningful share of diesel. He had no combine payment due in December. He had no land lien that could be called after 1 weak quarter. His strategy did not remove uncertainty. It reduced the number of entities allowed to punish him when uncertainty arrived. The 1,480 was slower than newer machines. It was also paid for. That trade-off, repeatedly chosen over 18 years, was now being tested under the exact conditions critics had predicted would expose him. 3 days passed with long shifts and controlled pace. The old International averaged just over 130 acres per day when fields stayed dry enough and dropped lower when moisture climbed. Travis accepted the lower speed and protected the machine because a single aggressive push that shattered a critical part would cost more than steady operation. Aaron handled grain cart timing and moisture notes, then entered elevator tickets at night. His nephew managed service intervals every morning before first light. Their system was not pretty. It was resilient. On paper, acres remaining finally began to move from alarming to plausible. At the end of one cold evening, Wade Larkin arrived at the edge of a field in a clean pickup and stood by the headland while the 1480 unloaded on the go. He waited until Travis shut down near the truck. "You are one breakdown from disaster," Wade said, still confident, still selling urgency. "I can have paperwork ready in 30 minutes. Travis wiped his hands with a rag, looked once at the cloud line, then at the machine. "I am harvesting," he said. "That is the paperwork." Wade left without another line, and the headlights disappeared down the section road. By the first week of November, the crisis had become measurable in hour-by-hour terms rather than rumor. Acres cut, acres standing, moisture discounts, basis movement, labor fatigue, parts wear, weather probability. The family name on the contract board was no longer protected by history. It was being protected by arithmetic, wrenchwork, and disciplined limits that had looked old-fashioned right up until they became the only flexible position in a tightening system. The combine, they called junk, kept moving through the dark, and each loaded truck bought another slice of daylight nobody could finance on demand. At 1:40 in the morning, with 186 acres still standing and a freezing rain line moving east faster than the evening model had projected, the 1480 lurched, coughed through the feeder, and went silent at the header. Travis climbed down with a flashlight, found the sheared feeder drive key, and stood still for a full 10 seconds, while wind pushed stubble against his boots. A tow to town would consume the window. Waiting for dealer parts would end the contract. He called Aaron on the radio, then called his nephew, and all three were back in the shop by 2:25 with the old steel stock rack pulled open. Aaron held the light while Travis micrometered the shaft and cut a blank. His nephew ran the drill press and deburred edges on a wheel that had lost half its guard years earlier. At 3:40, they drove the new key home, set tension, checked alignment, and greased every fitting on the feeder path for insurance. At 4:05, the engine started clean. At 4:12, separator engaged. At 4:20, they were back on the section road with ice starting to feather along ditch grass. By dawn, they were moving crop again. The next 36 hours were not dramatic from a distance. They were repetitive, cold, and exact. Cut, unload, fuel, grease, moisture check, repeat. Aaron ran grain cart and ticket folders. Travis watched engine temperature, rotor sound, and grain loss monitors with the concentration of a machinist, not a gambler. When they crossed the last pass on the final field, the notebook in his cab showed 1,480 acres complete, 54,880 bushels of spring wheat delivered at $7.42, and 608,000 pounds of sunflower delivered at 19 cents. Gross crop revenue booked for those deliveries stood at $522,729.60. The contract penalty schedule showed zero applied. The threatened $96,000 loss never posted. 2 days later, at the elevator scale in Huron, Wade Larkin made one more attempt, while 3 operators waited for grading slips, and 1 co-op clerk stapled settlement sheets behind the glass. "You beat weather once," Wade said, tone still polished, still urgent. "Now protect next year. I can lock your trade value while it is still there." Travis did not answer immediately. He took a white envelope from his jacket and handed it to the clerk with his input statement. The cashier's check was drawn for $286,400 even, payable to settle the season's fertilizer, seed, chemical, and drying balances in full. No carry. No renewal meeting in February. No lien filing. The clerk read the amount twice, keyed it in, and printed a paid receipt that reached halfway down the counter. Wade glanced at the check, then at Travis. "You did not have to tie up that much cash." Travis folded the receipt and put it in his pocket. "I did not tie it up. I cleared it." The reaction that mattered came 5 minutes later when the co-op manager stepped out, asked for a credit update because so many accounts were rolling, and Travis handed him a bank letter Aaron had requested that morning. Prairie State confirmed $612,780 in liquid operating and reserve cash after the input payoff, Treasury holdings at $598,000 market value, and zero-term debt secured by machinery or land. Total owned acres remained 2,060 with no mortgage encumbrance. Wade said nothing. One farmer by the coffee machine let out a short breath that could have been a laugh or surprise. The clerk, who had heard 10 years of commentary about Travis being behind the times, looked down at the paid receipt and then back up with a different expression, less pity than recalibration. By noon, that one document had traveled through more conversations than any sales brochure Wade had ever handed out. By late afternoon, the story had already crossed shop floors and diner counters, not as myth, but as arithmetic. Acres cut, contracts met, and every major bill settled without extending a single new note. The same afternoon, Travis followed through on the calls he had made during harvest. He told Eli, June, Peter, and Curtis that hauling work would run through cleanup and post-harvest transfers at fair rates, paid every Friday, no delay. He set Eli at $28 per loaded mile equivalent route, June and Peter on split shifts at $31 per hour for cleaning, bagging, and short-haul sunflower, and Curtis at $30 per hour running tandem loads where insurance allowed. Over 6 weeks, the work paid Eli $14,560, June $9,920, Peter $8,060, and Curtis $12,480 before winter. Those numbers did not solve their capital structures, but they stopped immediate bleed, kept heat on, and let each family enter December without new high-interest emergency borrowing. By the second week of January 2010, Travis and Aaron sat at the same kitchen table, where the ledger had changed purpose mid-harvest. This time the pages were not about survival math. They were about controlled generosity with enforceable terms. Net farm income for 2009 closed at $236,730 after all direct costs, labor allocations, taxes, and repair accruals. Travis moved $180,000 into conservative reserves, kept treasury ladders intact, and earmarked $300,000 for what Aaron titled the Tucker Equipment Circle. The structure was plain, written in 2 pages and signed without ceremony. 0 interest notes, 3 to 5 year terms depending on cash flow projections. Equipment and essential operating efficiency only, no land bidding wars, no cosmetic purchases, no rollover into unsecured consumption. Quarterly ledger review with Aaron. 1 mandatory clause: each recipient must mentor 1 newer operator within 3 years and document hours. 5 notes were issued by March. Eli Moreland received $92,000. He used $78,500 for a used combine with verified service history, $8,900 for header repairs, and $4,600 for preseason parts and fluids. His prior debt load had already forced him off 2,400 leased acres, so he reset to 640 acres with lower overhead and no machinery payment interest. His first year under the note produced thin but positive cash flow. By the end of year 2, he was current on every scheduled principal installment. June Halverson and Peter received $64,000 as a joint note. They allocated $22,000 to retire remaining high-cost carry on their operating line, $19,400 for hay equipment that opened custom work, $12,600 for fencing and water upgrades, and $10,000 to secure contract work through winter. 18 months later, they repurchased 40 acres they had been forced to sell. In their first debt-free quarter, June called Aaron and cried for less than a minute, then apologized, then laughed. Curtis Dane received $71,000 with a stricter covenant. No lease above a capped per-acre threshold tied to projected yield at conservative price assumptions. He used $34,000 for a paid-for tractor, $21,000 for a rebuilt drill, and held $16,000 as protected working buffer. He dropped from high-rent exposure to 480 lower-rent acres and exited all short-term notes by the end of his second operating cycle. The two additional recipients were younger operators who had solid records but no access to affordable machinery credit after rate shocks. Maya Renshaw received $39,000 for a used planter and grain handling upgrades that cut her custom hire costs by more than $11,000 annually. Nolan Vick received $34,000 for a haybine, baler rebuild, and transport trailer that allowed him to keep livestock feed costs predictable. Both signed the mentorship clause and both complied ahead of schedule. What mattered in town was that none of it came from spectacle. It came from ledgers, signed notes, and repayment calendars that treated discipline as a transferable tool rather than a private advantage. The deeper examination sat in Aaron's annual summary sheet, and it is where the prevailing assumptions fell apart under arithmetic. If Travis had accepted Wade's financed combine at $486,000 with 10% down and annual payments of $74,112 for 7 years, total scheduled payments would have been $518,784, plus $48,600 down, for $500 to $67,384 before insurance and incremental maintenance. Add conservative insurance at $12,000 per year, and ownership cost rose to $651,384 over the term. Subtract the actual $1,480 path, $21,660 total acquisition and field-ready repair, plus another $6,840 in off-season rebuild and storage prep, and the spread was $622,884. That spread funded the first 2 full years of the Tucker Equipment Circle. She also modeled liquidity resilience. With term debt zero, Travis could absorb one severe yield decline and still cover household, operating carry, and essential repairs by combining reserve cash flow and maturing treasuries. Under a financed machine structure, the same yield decline would have forced either asset liquidation or expensive refinancing inside a weak credit environment. The difference was not abstract philosophy. It was calendar math. Which obligations arrived regardless of weather, and which choices stayed optional. Year by year, the post-2009 ledger confirmed that the crisis had not been a one-time lucky escape. In 2010, Circle repayments received $41,800. New notes issued, $28,000. Net fund growth after defaults, 0 defaults. In 2011, repayments, $63,400. New notes, $46,000 to 2 second-round applicants mentored by Eli and Maya. In 2012, repayments, $74,200. New notes, $52,000. Cumulative principal recycled through the fund by end of 2012, $179,400. Every dollar returned was redeployed. 3 harvests later, those 5 original recipients and 4 second-round participants were operating a combined 3,460 acres with far lower debt service than peers of similar scale. At county average land values near $2,300 per acre. By then, the land they controlled and owned represented an asset base around $7,958,000. Travis did not own that value. He had helped preserve the operating capacity behind it. Wade's resolution came without speeches. His branch, built on high-margin finance volume, thinned as defaults climbed and trade-ins flooded used lots. In 2012, it closed. He took a regional parts position and, according to 2 younger operators who asked for candid guidance, started recommending late-model used equipment with clear maintenance records instead of pushing the largest note a balance sheet could momentarily carry. He never made a public apology. he changed behavior. On a cold evening after paperwork season, Aaron filed paid receipts, bank confirmations, and circle notes in labeled binders on the pantry shelf, then wrote one line on the inside cover of the 2009 ledger. Harvested in full, paid in full, helped forward. Travis read it, nodded once, and reached for his coat because chores still needed doing before dark. He stepped off the porch into a blue cold dusk, crossed to the calving shed, and finished chores in the same order he had used for years. Feed first, water second, gates last. Nothing in that order hinted that he had just altered 6 families' balance sheets. That was his pattern. Major decisions at the kitchen table. Ordinary work before dark. By the end of that week, Aaron had already mailed the first quarterly reminders for Tucker Equipment Circle. Each one typed, each one page, each one ending with the same sentence. Send your ledger, not your promises. By March 2010, the first recipient reports showed why structure mattered. Eli Moreland's reset to 640 acres looked small beside what he once ran, yet his numbers stopped bleeding. He grossed $286,400 on grain and custom combining, carried operating costs of $228,900, and closed with $57,500 before a family draw and taxes. His circle principal payment was $18,400 on schedule. More important, he did not borrow to hide weak margins. He cut one hired pass, repaired an older header himself, and deferred a pickup replacement. He told Aaron during review, "I missed the scale. I do not miss the fear." In 2011, he paid another $24,600 principal, then mentored a younger operator, Caleb Jensen, through machinery budgeting and pre-buy fuel timing. Caleb later avoided a variable note that would have lifted his annual fixed costs by $19,000. June Halverson and Peter moved slower, then steadier. Their first season after the note looked uneven because they were rebuilding both equipment and confidence, but cash discipline held. Custom hay brought in $43,700 in 2010, then $68,200 in 2011 as repeat clients increased. They used circle terms exactly as designed, paying principal every quarter and refusing 2 dealer offers that looked attractive only in year 1. By the first week of October 2012, June called Aaron with a clipped, practical voice and said they had repurchased the 40 acres they once sold at $86,000 cash from savings and hay revenue retained over 30 months. She did not make a speech. She said, "Put that in your file," then thanked Travis in person with a pie and a handwritten receipt copy folded inside the pan lid. Curtis Dane resisted the rent cap covenant for 1 season, then admitted it had saved him from repeating the same mistake. In 2010, he passed on 300 acres priced at $318 per acre, and instead signed 220 acres at $186 with lower yield variability and shorter haul distance. His gross was lower than his expansion years, but net improved because volatility fell. In 2011, he paid off all short-term notes, and in 2013, he bought 80 acres at $176,000 with a staged cash plan rather than leverage. At his third review, he slid a yellow pad across Aaron's table, showing 3 scenarios: base, dry, and weak price, each still positive without refinancing. Travis read it and only said, "Now you are farming numbers, not weather stories." Maya Renshaw and Nolan Vick delivered the fastest mentorship compliance and the clearest multiplier effect. Maya's $39,000 note cut her annual custom hire expense by $11,300 as projected. Then she added grain handling efficiency that reduced harvest weight penalties by another $4,900 in her second year. She mentored Leanne Brost, who used those same planning templates to acquire a used drill package at 42% of comparable new cost and remained current through two volatile seasons. Nolan's $34,000 package stabilized feed planning and reduced emergency hay purchases by $13,600 in 2011 alone. He mentored Aaron Pike, who shifted from reactive purchases to contracted feed windows and reported his first positive retained earnings line in 4 years. If you want to know whether disciplined generosity scales beyond one good harvest, pay attention to this next sequence. By December 2013, the Circle had issued $426,000 in total notes across 9 operators, collected $312,400 in principal repayments, recorded 0 charge-offs, and revolved $198,000 into second-round loans. Those 9 operators collectively controlled or owned 3,460 acres in 2010. By 2014, they were at 4,180 acres, with lower average debt service per acre than comparable operations in 3 neighboring townships. At a conservative average land value of $2,350 per acre, that operating base represented $9,823,000 in underlying asset exposure kept in productive hands. One mocked combine decision had not merely preserved one contract. It had preserved local productive capacity. The model hardened during stress years. In 2012, a dry spell clipped yields and tested everyone's assumptions again. Circle policy required downside budgets before planning, so each recipient had already run numbers at lower bushel outcomes. Eli reduced nitrogen rates on marginal ground and protected core acres, sacrificing potential top end for survivability. June and Peter shifted labor toward custom hay when grain margins narrowed. Curtis held cash and left one block unbid rather than chase acres at bad rent. Maya delayed a bin expansion and kept liquidity. Nolan sold extra small square bales into a shortage market and retired the remainder of his note a year early. Different tactics, same framework. Control fixed obligations first. The antagonist's trajectory became clear by 2012, and it never required public humiliation. Wade Larkin's branch had been optimized for finance volume during easy credit years, so when defaults rose and trade values softened, unit turnover slowed while carrying costs climbed. Corporate consolidated locations, and his branch closed. He moved into a regional parts role with lower commissions and steadier salary. At first, he kept old habits, pushing replacements before diagnosis. Then younger operators began asking direct questions they should have asked earlier. What can we keep running safely? And what must we replace now? Wade started answering differently. He pulled maintenance histories, pointed to used inventories with verified service records, and in at least 6 documented cases guided first-time buyers toward machines priced under $90,000 instead of packages above $300,000. In February 2014, Wade walked into Tucker's yard to deliver a hard-to-find gearbox and found the 1978 148O parked clean in the machine shed, header off, belts loosened for storage, paint still faded, sheet metal still dented, everything orderly. Travis signed the part slip. Then Wade stood looking at the old machine for several seconds and said, "I sold urgency for too long." Travis answered with the same restraint that had defined every turning point in this story. Most people did. That was the closest either man came to an apology scene. It was enough. Wade retired in 2021 from the parts distribution And two younger farmers later said he had saved them from oversized notes by insisting on repair first math. By the spring of 2015, Aaron had fully taken over quarterly circle reviews, treasury ladder tracking, and contract documentation. She built a color-coded ledger system that flagged payment drift by 15 days, projected seasonal cash troughs, and required recipients to submit 3-line corrective plans instead of long explanations. Her method was firm, never theatrical, and it worked. Delinquencies remained low. Mentorship hours were documented. The fund rotated without drama. Travis still signed major disbursements, but he read more than he spoke and let her run the table. The nephew, who had helped rebuild the 1480, completed an agricultural mechanics program, came back part-time during harvest, and eventually opened a small repair shop near Woolsey, focused on extending life in older combines and drills. He called his pricing model clear labor, clear parts, no mystery. Walter Klein, the older neighbor who once said, "Pay me when you can," had passed years earlier, yet his influence stayed active in ways he never saw. In 2016, Travis and Aaron visited Walter's daughter with a cashier's check for $25,000, designated for a community tool scholarship at the Technical College in Huron, restricted to farm mechanics. Students who agreed to complete 120 service hours for local operators each year. No plaque was requested. The college filed it as the Klein Practical Skills Award. By 2024, 14 students had used it. 11 still worked in rural counties within 90 miles. The roll call by then was unusually complete for rural stories that usually fray at the edges. Eli Moreland was still farming, now 820 acres, debt service controlled, circle note fully repaid in 2014, and mentoring his second operator. June Halverson had reduced daily field work but still handled books and customer calls. Peter managed operations across 260 owned acres and custom hay routes with no machinery interest expense and 2 paid-for tractors. Curtis Dane farmed 520 acres within cash flow, owned 80 acres free and clear, and taught rent risk sessions at winter co-op meetings. Maya Renshaw expanded to 610 acres with disciplined upgrades and no term equipment debt. Leanne Brost, her mentee, remained current and profitable through 2 difficult price years. Nolan Vick maintained a mixed hay and livestock operation. Note retired early, and Aaron Pike transitioned from survival mode to retained earnings for the first time in a decade. Wade Larkin was retired, living quietly near Mitchell, occasionally consulting on parts sourcing, and known among younger operators as the man who finally started saying, "Show me your cash flow before we talk paint." Aaron managed ledgers for both the farm and the circle. The nephew's repair shop booked 3 months out every fall. The 1996 Chevrolet still started most mornings, now over 400,000 miles, rust unchanged except where patched with primer and patience. The 1480 remained retired but preserved, not as a shrine, as a record. The 1989 John Deere 9600 never returned to primary duty. It was parted carefully, and usable components were cataloged and sold at fair prices to neighboring farmers who needed one more season from older machines. If this story has given you value, subscribe so you can follow more cases where arithmetic beats image. Then leave a comment with one number you track on your own operation that changed your decisions, and share this with one farmer you know who feels cornered by note pressure right now. Travis aged without changing style. He kept patched overalls, mended what he could, and rejected easy narratives about luck. When asked for advice, he usually offered one sentence and returned to work. In late autumn years, he would stand by the shed door, look at the preserved 1480, then at trucks loading out grain under Aaron's scheduling and say, "Keep choices open." That was his full doctrine. Not anti-technology, not nostalgia. Optionality purchased in advance. He passed peacefully in 2023 after a short illness, at home, with Aaron and family present, chores already assigned for the next morning. The farm did not liquidate. The circle did not dissolve. Aaron became managing trustee under documents prepared years earlier, with one non-negotiable clause carried forward. No debt used to impress, only measured obligations tied to clear cash flow and real productivity. By harvest 2025, the Tucker name was still on the grain contract board. Not because history protected it, because numbers did. At sunset, on a cool October evening, the old Chevrolet sat by the machine shed. And through the open door, the faded red 1480 caught a stripe of light across its side panel. Outside, newer machines moved in neighboring fields. Inside, one old combine rested clean and ready, a reminder that the poorest-looking man in the county had never been poor at all. He had been liquid, patient, and exact, and he had turned that discipline outward until other families could stand on their own books again. 3 days after that October sunset, Aaron unlocked the pantry cabinet, carried the 2009 binder to the kitchen table, and laid out every paper that had once ridden in her father's coat pockets. Wade's $486,000 financing quote, with 9.75% typed in bold, the fuel receipt he had folded beside it, the handwritten $18,400 bill of sale for the $1,480, the clipboard page marked $21,660, and the co-op paid in full receipt for $286,400. She did not frame them. She scanned them, indexed them, and put originals in fire sleeves labeled Contract Year Save. The physical trail mattered because people forget tone first and number second, and she was not going to let either disappear. That evening, Eli, June, Peter, Curtis, Maya, Nolan, Caleb, Leanne, and Aaron filed into the same kitchen in muddy boots and clean notebooks. Aaron poured coffee, opened the circle ledger, and started with rules, exactly as Travis had done. Principal first, mentorship logs second, expansion last. Nobody argued. Eli handed over his annual sheet showing $46,000 net retained after family draw on 820 acres, with zero machinery interest and one paid-for combine overhaul at $12,700 cash. June and Peter set down their custom hay contracts and a bank letter, confirming no operating carry through quarter end. Curtis brought 3 rent bids he had declined because break-even failed at conservative yield assumptions. Maya showed harvest wait time reductions after adding a second used grain cart for $14,800 cash. Nolan submitted feed inventory and a prepaid diesel schedule that reduced winter exposure by 39 cents per gallon across 6,000 gallons. By the first Monday of November 2025, Aaron closed the meeting with hard totals on a whiteboard by the old porch bucket her father never replaced. Circle principal issued to date $612,000. Principal repaid $544,600. Outstanding $67,400. Charge-off 0. Mentorship pairings completed 16. Active acreage among recipients and mentees, 5,040. At a county average land value of $3,180 per acre, the ground they controlled or owned represented $16,027,200 in productive capacity, still anchored to operators running inside cash flow. One decision in 2009 had become a structure, and the structure had become local ballast. Wade's final reckoning came quietly in January 2026 at a machinery clinic in Mitchell, where he had been asked to speak on parts planning for older fleets. He stood near a table of worn sprockets and rebuilt hydraulic pumps, and looked nothing like the man in the press shirt who once sold urgency as certainty. He wore a plain work jacket, bifocals low on his nose, and opened with a sentence no one expected from him 15 years earlier. If your payment date arrives, whether the crop does or not, that machine owns you. After the session, a young operator asked if he should sign for a new package priced at $412,000 with seasonal terms. Wade asked for his ledger, waited through an embarrassed pause, then said, "Bring your real numbers next week. If we cannot make this survive a weak year, do not buy paint." He sent him to Aaron for a second opinion before any signature. 2 weeks later, that operator bought a used combine for $96,500, paid $8,200 for preventive repairs, and kept his annual fixed obligations under control. Wade did not take a commission. He logged part numbers and went home. In March 2026, he drove to the Tucker farm in his own old half-ton, not a dealer truck, and stood with Aaron in the machine shed aisle between the preserved 1,480 and bins of labeled 9,600 components that had nearly all been sold off over the years. Only 3 remained: a sensor harness, 1 pulley, and a feeder chain section tagged for emergency neighbor use. Wade tapped the 1480's side panel once. "I used to think this was failure delayed," he said. Aaron answered without softness or edge. "It was freedom purchased." He nodded, left a parts catalog with repair notes he had handwritten for 2 younger farmers, and did not ask for anything. By late April, the Klein Practical Skills Award interviews were held at the Technical College in Huron, and Walter Klein's daughter sat beside Aaron at a folding table with scholarship files stacked in blue folders. The fund had started with Travis's $25,000 check and now stood at $61,300 after additional gifts from Circle graduates. 2 students were selected that year, both from farm families that had postponed repairs because labor rates outran cash flow. Each signed the same service clause, 120 hours local field support, and each logged those hours by harvest. Walter's 5-word ethic, "pay me when you can," had moved from memory to institution. On the first humid day of June 2026, Aaron called each original recipient for the annual recorded check-in, and every call closed a thread that once looked fragile. Eli reported his second mentee, now current through 2 seasons, and confirmed his own operation had carried positive retained earnings for 7 straight years. June laughed when Aaron asked about the old panic years and said, "I sleep now." Peter had purchased a second baler with cash and hired 1 full-time hand at wages he could sustain without borrowing. Curtis had refused another high-rent block and instead tiled 60 owned acres for drainage, paying $38,400 cash and improving consistency rather than acreage count. Maya filed the cleanest ledger in the group, color-coded and exact with no unexplained variance beyond $300. Nolan had fully transitioned his mentee Aaron into independent planning reviews, and Aaron's latest sheet showed a retained line he had once thought was for other people. Caleb and Leanne met at the farm that same week to deliver mentorship affidavits and stayed long enough to help Aaron shift pallets in the machine shed. They found the old coffee can labeled Feeder Key 2009 on the back shelf, wrapped in oily cloth. Aaron opened it, held the machine key in her palm, then put it back and wrote 1 new label line. Kept for record, not reuse. The key had done its work. By harvest 2026, the Tucker board at the elevators still carried the family name, and the co-op clerk, who had once reread that $286,400 check, stood at the same window, now manager, greeting Aaron with no trace of old assumptions. He processed her settlement sheets, glanced at moisture figures, and said, "Your father was right about one thing." Aaron waited. "Paid for works." She smiled once and slid the next ticket under the glass. The roll call settled into place without fanfare. Travis was gone, buried on a bright week in 2023, and still present in every policy line Aaron refused to soften. Aaron managed the farm and the circle, drove the 1996 Chevrolet when weather allowed, and finally repaired the porch roof only after proving the budget 3 ways. The nephew's repair shop in Woolsey expanded to 2 bays and an apprentice, with posted rates and no hidden labor lines. Eli was farming, mentoring, and current. June and Peter were farming and debt-controlled. Curtis was farming within cap discipline. Maya was expanding carefully and teaching others to read obligations before brochures. Nolan was stable and generous with time. Caleb, Leanne, and Aaron were no longer cautionary possibilities. They were operators with books that closed in black. Wade was retired from parts work in all but occasional consulting, known now for saying no when the math said no. Walter Klein had been gone for years, yet his sentence outlived him in ledgers across 3 counties. At dusk on an October evening, Aaron shut the machine shed doors halfway and left them there, enough for a stripe of light to lie across the faded red side of the 1480. Outside sat the old Chevrolet, rusted, functional, tailgate latch finally repaired, but still carrying the grain shovel in the bed out of habit. In neighboring fields, newer combines moved under bright cab lights, fast and efficient, and nobody on this farm pretended those machines were foolish. The point had never been old versus new. The point was obligation versus choice. Appearance had misled almost everyone at first. Patched overalls looked like scarcity. A wired tailgate looked like failure. A leaking porch looked like decline. The underlying books told another story. 0 term debt when rates rose, liquidity when weather narrowed, ownership when leases broke, and generosity when others were forced into retreat. That is why the family name stayed on the contract board. Not because tradition demanded it, because arithmetic defended it, then shared its margin with people who were willing to learn the same discipline and pass it forward.